Husband betrays family. The shocking price of a desperate gamble. True crime secrets. Hook. What would you do if the most devastating mistake of your life tore your family apart? This is the story of a man who gambled with his own flesh and blood and lost everything. Stay with us to uncover the shocking consequences of a decision he could never undo, and the one thing he could never escape. The air was thick with tension, like something was waiting to snap. It was an ordinary evening, or so it seemed. The house was eerily quiet, save for the hum of a fridge and the soft flicker of a dying candle. A man sat at the kitchen table, his hands shaking. He didn't know what had come over him. The envelope on the table was heavy. Inside, it felt like a betrayal. He stared at it, as if the paper would give him some answer. But no answer came. Only a faint rustle from the other room, his wife humming softly as she cleaned. His heart pounded, his thoughts scattered. The past weeks had been a blur of reckless decisions and promises made in shadows. She didn't know, of course. She never would. He had made sure of that. But the guilt gnawed at him, sinking its teeth into his soul. The child, their little girl, was upstairs. She was innocent, unaware of the growing storm. He thought back to that night, the one that had started all of this. The bar, the smoke, the strangers' voices low and promising. The deal had been made in a whisper, a handshake sealed with desperation. A gamble he couldn't take back, one that had cost more than money. And now it was time to pay the price. He rose from the table, each step slow, deliberate. The air felt colder now. A shadow seemed to creep along the walls, stretching longer with every movement. He reached for the envelope. His fingers brushed it once, twice, and then he ripped it open. Inside, there was a name that would change everything. Suddenly, the door creaked open. His wife stood in the doorway, a smile on her face. She looked so unaware, so peaceful. But there was something in her eyes, something strange. "Is everything all right?" Her voice was soft, gentle. She didn't know. She couldn't know. He stared at her, unable to speak, his throat dry. For a long moment, the room was still. The weight of the envelope felt like 1,000 pounds. He swallowed hard. Then, without a word, he crumpled the paper in his hand. It was time. Time to face the consequences. That he looked at her, his wife, the woman he once promised to protect. Her smile faltered, just a little, as she took a step closer. "What's wrong?" Her voice now held an edge of concern. He couldn't bear to meet her eyes. He felt the room closing in, suffocating him. His breath caught in his chest. Outside, the wind howled, slapping the windows. The house creaked, groaned under the pressure. But it wasn't the storm outside that made him shiver. It was the storm inside, the one he had created. "Everything's fine," he said, the words coming out too fast, too forced. He could feel the lie in his throat, thick and bitter. His hands were still trembling. She reached out to touch his arm. The warmth of her fingers, the gentleness, it made him sick. He wanted to pull away, but he couldn't. Her touch felt like a chain, a reminder of the innocence he was about to destroy. "Are you sure?" she asked, her face soft with concern. He nodded, but it was empty. Empty as the room, empty as his heart. The silence stretched between them, unbearable. Then, a noise upstairs. A soft, curious sound, like a small footstep. Their daughter. His heart stopped for a second. The child. The one he had betrayed, sold. The one who would never understand. "I'll go check on her," he murmured, his voice cracking. His wife didn't argue. She simply nodded, her eyes still searching his face for something, for truth. But there was no truth left, not in him. He stepped out of the kitchen, moving like a man walking to his own execution. The hallway stretched out before him, dark and narrow. The flickering light from the kitchen barely touched the edges of the corridor. He reached the stairs and stopped. His breath was heavy now, the air colder. His heart pounded in his chest, a frantic beat that didn't match the stillness of the house. Upstairs, their daughter's room was at the end of the hall. He could almost hear her breathing. The innocence, the trust. He stepped forward, each footfall a promise he had broken. As he reached the door, he hesitated. His hand hovered over the doorknob. What was he supposed to do now? How could he look at her, knowing what he had done? The room beyond was dark, save for the faint moonlight creeping through the window. Her bed was empty, but the sheets were tangled, as if she had just been there. A small doll lay on the floor, its face twisted in a permanent, frozen smile. He stepped inside, his breath shallow. Where was she? His eyes scanned the room, and then he heard it, a faint giggle, almost muffled, coming from the closet. His stomach turned. He froze. The closet door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness behind it. His feet moved on their own, reluctant but determined. Each step felt heavier than the last. He reached the closet and pushed the door open. There, sitting on the floor, was his daughter, her eyes wide, staring at him with an innocence that made his heart ache. She was holding something, a small, worn piece of paper. His heart skipped. The same paper, the envelope. "Daddy," she said in a small voice, her fingers clutching the edge of the crumpled letter. Her voice was so calm, so unnerving. "How come you look so sad?" He couldn't answer. He couldn't even speak. The words were stuck in his throat, lodged there by guilt, by fear. She smiled at him, that same innocent smile, the one that he had promised to protect. He knelt down, trembling, and took the paper from her hands. It was the contract, the one he had signed, the one that had sealed her fate. She had found it, and yet she didn't understand. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice breaking. The room seemed to spin. The walls felt like they were closing in. His daughter looked at him with confusion in her eyes. "Why not, Daddy? I was just looking for you." He choked back a sob. The guilt threatened to crush him, but he couldn't let her see it. He couldn't let her know what he had done. But there was no hiding now, no turning back. His fingers gripped the paper tighter, as if it might slip away, as if the truth could somehow vanish with it. But it wouldn't. The truth was right there, staring him in the face. His daughter didn't know. She couldn't know. But the weight of what he had done was unbearable, suffocating. He rose to his feet slowly, the room spinning, his mind a blur of panic. He couldn't keep this secret from her forever. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. "Sweetheart," he started, his voice barely a whisper, "there's something I need to tell you." Her eyes were wide, still innocent, still trusting. The very thing he had betrayed. But before he could speak another word, the sound of a door opening downstairs froze him in place. His wife's voice, calling up the stairs. "Is everything all right? Why aren't you coming down?" The warmth in her tone only made it worse. His breath caught. He couldn't face her now, not with this weight on his shoulders, not with their daughter holding the evidence of his crime in her tiny hands. "Just a second, Mommy," the little girl called out, her voice light, unbothered. And for a moment, the house felt too quiet, too still. He glanced down at his daughter again. She was still holding the paper, her innocent gaze fixed on him, waiting for him to say something. Anything. He stepped back, the guilt pulling at his chest. He couldn't keep her in the dark forever, but he also couldn't bear to tell her the truth. The darkness in the room seemed to deepen, closing in on him. Every breath felt heavier. The walls pressed tighter. He was suffocating. His daughter's voice broke the silence again. "Daddy, are you okay?" There was concern now, and it cut through him like a knife. He looked at her one last time, the child he had betrayed. Her innocence was slipping away, piece by piece, just like his soul. "Everything's fine," he said again, but this time, the lie tasted even worse. The door downstairs creaked open again. His wife was coming up, and he had to make a choice. The moment had arrived, his heart pounded in his chest, each beat an explosion of regret. His wife's footsteps were closer now, slow and deliberate. He couldn't keep this from her any longer. The truth had been sitting between them for too long, festering. But how could he say it? How could he tear down everything they had built? The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. His daughter's innocent gaze was like a dagger to his soul. How could he have done this to her? The footsteps stopped just outside the door. His wife's voice, softer now. "Are you two all right?" Her voice seemed so far away, but the weight of it pressed on him like a vice. He stood frozen, unable to speak. His mouth felt dry, his throat tight. The moment was slipping away. Too soon. Too fast. "Daddy." His daughter's voice broke through the chaos in his mind. Her small hand reached up toward him, her fingers curling around his. It was the touch of innocence, of trust. The very thing he had traded away. His wife knocked gently at the door. "Don't make me come in there," she teased, but there was a hint of concern beneath it. He couldn't keep lying to her. Not anymore. The silence stretched. His heart thudded in his ears. He looked down at his daughter again, her face unmarked by the darkness he had already plunged them into. And yet, she was already a part of it. He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his decision bearing down on him. He could say nothing. He could walk away, pretend it never happened, bury it deeper. Or he could face it, look into his wife's eyes, and destroy everything. The door handle turned, slowly, deliberately, and there she stood, his wife, her eyes searching the room, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. But something in her gaze, something had shifted. "Everything okay?" she asked, her eyes flicking between him and their daughter. And for the briefest of moments, he thought she might know. But no, she couldn't know. Could she? His words escaped him, caught in the web of lies he had woven around them. The moment was here. The choice had been made. And there was no turning back. His wife stepped inside, the door creaking softly behind her. Her eyes moved from him to their daughter, still sitting on the floor with that small, crumpled piece of paper in her hand. There was a quiet tension in the room, thick and heavy. His wife's smile faltered for just a second, as if sensing something was wrong, but she said nothing. She glanced down at their daughter, then back at him, her expression softening with concern. "Why is she holding that?" Her voice was gentle, but there was a note of unease creeping in. He couldn't answer. The words were locked inside him, suffocating him with every breath he took. His throat felt like it was closing up, the weight of the moment pressing on him. His wife stepped closer to their daughter, reaching out to take the paper from her hand. But the little girl didn't let go. She looked up at her mother, her face unreadable, and for a moment everything froze. His wife's hand hovered in the air, unsure. "Mommy," their daughter said softly, her voice quiet, almost too calm. "Why is Daddy sad?" His wife's hand dropped. Her eyes flicked back to him, a flicker of suspicion starting to form. "Why don't you go play in the living room, sweetheart?" she said to their daughter, her voice too high-pitched, too forced. But the little girl didn't move. She didn't answer. She just stared at him, her innocent gaze piercing through him like a knife. "Sweetheart," his wife said again, a little more firmly, and finally the girl stood up, the paper still clutched in her hand. She shuffled out of the room, leaving them alone. The silence felt deafening. As soon as the door clicked shut behind their daughter, his wife turned to him. The smile had vanished from her face entirely, her brow furrowed, eyes narrowing as she looked at him, studying him closely. "What's going on, John?" Her voice was low now, thick with suspicion. Why was she holding that? The tension in the room was unbearable, suffocating. He couldn't meet her gaze. He couldn't lie to her anymore. I didn't. His voice faltered. The words wouldn't come. His mind raced, spinning, but there was nothing to say. Nothing that would make it right. His wife stepped closer, her eyes hardening. "I need you to tell me the truth now," she demanded. The pressure was too much. He could feel his chest tightening, his breath shallow and uneven. He started again, but his throat closed up. His hand reached out, trembling, as if trying to push the truth away. But it was too late. It had already caught up with him. His wife's gaze dropped to the crumpled paper on the floor, and then back to him. Her face paled. "You didn't," she whispered, her voice breaking. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. She knew. She knew everything. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing tighter with every breath he took. His wife's eyes never left him, her face a mask of disbelief and horror. The truth was out, hanging between them like a shadow, too dark to ignore. She took a step back, her hand rising to her mouth, as if to stifle a cry that she couldn't suppress. "Tell me you didn't, John," she whispered, her voice cracking with pain. Her eyes searched his face, pleading for a lie, for anything but the truth. But he couldn't lie to her anymore. Not now. Not when everything had unraveled. I didn't mean for it to happen like this," he stammered, his voice shaking. He wanted to explain, to somehow justify it, but the words came out in broken pieces. I thought it was the only way. The weight of his actions crushed him. He could barely breathe, let alone speak. She shook her head, her eyes welling with tears. "John, you sold our daughter." The words felt like knives in his chest, each syllable cut deeper than the last. "I was desperate," he choked out, unable to stop the flood of guilt that surged through him. "I didn't know what else to do. The debts, the people I owed. I thought this was the only way to save us." His wife took a step back, as if his words had physically pushed her away. The horror on her face was too much to bear. "How could you?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but it felt like a scream in the quiet room. "How could you do this to our daughter? To me?" He could hear her heartbreak, the shattering of everything they had built. She wasn't just angry, she was destroyed. "I didn't think it would go this far. I never thought it would." The words faltered in his throat. He couldn't finish the sentence, because he knew, deep down, there was no excuse for what he had done. His wife turned away, her shoulders trembling, tears now falling freely. He could only watch, helpless, as she sank to the floor, her hands pressed to her face, trying to muffle the sobs that racked her body. And in that moment, he realized that everything he had feared had come true. He had lost her. He had lost them both. The silence stretched on, suffocating him. The truth was out, and there was no going back. Not now. Not ever. But he stood there motionless, as his wife's sobs filled the room, each one tearing through him like 1,000 needles. The sound of her grief was a heavy weight pressing down on his chest, suffocating him, demanding a reckoning. He wanted to say something, anything to make it right, but the words felt empty, hollow. How could he undo the damage? How could he take back the lie that had festered between them, the betrayal that had poisoned everything? His heart was beating erratically, pounding in his ears. He felt his own breath growing shallow, his mind spiraling into chaos. But all he could hear was the sound of her crying, the only sound that mattered now. She looked up at him through tear-streaked eyes, her face a mix of disbelief and sorrow. "How could you do this?" she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost a plea. "I thought I knew you. I thought we were in this together." Her words struck him harder than anything, because she was right. They had been in it together until now. He sank to his knees in front of her, desperate to reach her, desperate for forgiveness. But he knew there was no easy way out. Not this time. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. "I never meant for it to get this far. I never meant to hurt you or her." His wife didn't respond. She just stared at him, her expression unreadable, like the world had shifted beneath her feet, and she no longer knew where she stood. His heart broke as he watched her pull away, like she was physically distancing herself from him, from the man she thought she had married. The trust they had shared was gone, shattered beyond repair. I thought. He started, but the words caught in his throat. He wanted to tell her everything, the fear, the desperation, the promises he had made in the shadows. But nothing he said could undo the horror in her eyes. There was a knock at the door, a light, tentative knock, followed by a small voice. "Mommy? Daddy? What's going on?" His stomach twisted. It was their daughter, the one he had sold, the one who had unknowingly stumbled into a nightmare. His wife stood up abruptly, wiping her face, trying to compose herself. But the crack in her voice was unmistakable when she spoke. "Stay in your room, sweetie," she said, her voice faltering. "I'll be right there." He could hear the tiny footsteps retreating down the hallway, and it felt like the last nail in the coffin of their family. Everything had changed. Everything was broken. His wife turned back to him, eyes hardening, lips trembling. "You sold our daughter, John." She said it again, as if trying to force herself to believe it, to wrap her mind around the impossible. You sold our daughter." And there it was, the final truth. The one he could never escape. The words echoed in the room, vibrating in the air between them, suffocating him. "You sold our daughter." Each syllable twisted like a knife, carving deeper into his already shattered heart. He could barely breathe, the reality of it crashing over him like a relentless wave. His wife's gaze was cold now, like a shard of ice had replaced the warmth that once lived there. The pain in her eyes was sharper than anything he had ever felt. It was worse than the betrayal, worse than the fear, because it was his fault. "I never wanted it to be like this," he muttered, the words hollow and useless. But they were the only words he had left. "I thought I could fix it all. I thought I could protect us." Her eyes narrowed, disbelief still flickering in her expression. "You don't sell people, John. You don't make deals like that." Her voice cracked on the word people, and it struck him harder than anything else had. She wasn't just angry anymore. She was disgusted. "I was desperate," he whispered, but the excuse felt so weak, so fragile. He had nothing left to justify it, nothing to fix the gaping wound he had created between them. "I thought it would be the last resort. I thought I could get us out of the hole we were in." "You didn't think at all," she spat, her voice rising with the hurt, with the betrayal. "You didn't think about what this would do to her, to us." She took a step back, as if physically distancing herself from him, from the man who had once been her partner, her equal. "Do you even understand what you've done?" she asked, her voice trembling with the weight of it all. Her eyes were wide, searching him for something, anything, to prove that he wasn't the monster she now saw him as. But he had nothing to offer. His mind was spiraling, the guilt and shame consuming him. Everything he had done to protect them had unraveled. He had only made things worse. I never thought. But the words didn't make sense anymore. The thoughts collided in his mind, each one more twisted than the last. He had sacrificed his daughter's future, her safety, for a chance to fix a problem that was beyond his control. And now there was no going back. The silence between them was deafening. He couldn't look at her anymore. He couldn't meet her eyes, because the truth was staring back at him too clearly. Her voice broke the stillness, soft but final. "I don't know who you are anymore, John." Her words landed like a slap to his face, each one cutting deeper. "I don't know who you've become." His daughter, who had once looked at him with such admiration, now seemed lost in her own confusion. She kept glancing from one parent to the other, as if searching for some explanation, some thread that could tie the shattered pieces of their world back together. But there was no thread, not anymore. The silence pressed down on him, suffocating him from all sides. His heart was racing, but his limbs felt frozen. He wanted to say something, anything to fix this, to make it right, but his voice failed him. All that remained was the crushing weight of his betrayal. "I never wanted this," he finally croaked, his voice raw. The words felt empty, pathetic. He had to say something, didn't he? But how could he possibly make her understand? How could he make either of them understand? His wife looked up at him then, her eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it almost made him fall to his knees. But it wasn't just sorrow. It was something colder, something harder. It was the look of a woman who had been irreparably broken, a woman who had seen the worst of him and could never unsee it. "You never wanted this," she whispered, her voice trembling with suppressed anger. But there was no anger in her eyes, just pain, a pain that he had caused, a pain that had no cure. His daughter stirred in her arms, shifting her gaze between her parents, sensing the heaviness in the air, the unspoken words that hung like a storm ready to break. "Mommy? Daddy? What's wrong?" Her voice was small, tentative, like a whisper in the storm, and in that moment he saw it. The last of her innocence slipping away. He wanted to reach for her, to hold her, to promise her that it would all be okay. But he couldn't. He was the one who had caused this. He had brought this nightmare into their lives. And now, there's no way to undo it. His wife's eyes moved back to their daughter, and she gently stroked her hair, as if trying to shield her from the truth, shield her from what he had done. But it was too late for that. The truth had already been laid bare. "Sweetheart," she said softly, her voice tight with emotion, "everything's going to be okay." But even as she said the words, they felt hollow, like the final, desperate attempt to hold on to something that was already slipping through her fingers. John could hear the rawness in her voice, and it only made the guilt consume him more. He was the one who had destroyed their world. He had brought them to this point where they were no longer a family, but strangers bound together by a past he could never erase. He stepped back, his legs unsteady, as the weight of his decisions crashed down on him. There was no going back, no escape from the horror he had unleashed. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though the words felt as meaningless as ever. But his wife didn't even look at him. She was focused on their daughter, trying to shield her from the storm that John had caused, even if it was already too late. The silence between them was no longer just deafening. It was suffocating. His family was slipping away, piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. All he had left were his apologies, and they weren't enough. They would never be enough. And in that stillness, with his heart shattering into a million pieces, he realized he had lost them. Lost them both. Forever. He stood there, paralyzed, his gaze fixed on the two most important people in his life, his wife, holding their daughter close, their bond still strong despite the breaking of everything else. He wanted to reach out, to say something, anything, that might bring them back, but his body felt like lead, his voice swallowed by the enormity of his guilt. His daughter, so innocent, her small hand still grasping her mother's, looked up at her with those trusting eyes. But there was something different now, something subtle but undeniable. The shift in her, the growing understanding of the pain that had been inflicted upon her. John could see it in the way she clung to her mother, as though she was trying to hold on to what was left of their family. Her innocent questions were replaced by a quiet wariness, and it broke him. "Mommy, are we going to be okay?" Her voice was small, full of uncertainty. And it wasn't just a question for her mother anymore. It was for both of them. For him. His heart thudded painfully in his chest. The words he had been too afraid to speak, too ashamed to face, were now sitting between them like a suffocating fog. How could he answer her? How could he promise her that everything would be okay when he had shattered their lives with one desperate, irrevocable choice? He took a shaky step forward, but the look on his wife's face froze him in his tracks. It wasn't anger or resentment, not anymore. It was just an emptiness, a hollow look that spoke volumes more than any words could. She wasn't looking at him with the love they once shared. She wasn't looking at him at all. She was looking beyond him, as though the man he was no longer existed in her eyes. He began, but the words fell away before they could even form. What could he say? He had no excuse, no reason that could ever justify what he had done. He had given his daughter away, and now she was stuck in a broken world because of it. His wife took a deep breath, steadying herself, but her eyes never left the child in her arms. "She'll never forgive you for this," she said quietly, almost to herself, as if the weight of it had finally sunk in. Her voice was calm, eerily so, but there was a finality in it that sent a chill down his spine. It was a simple truth, and he knew it was one he could never change. He felt a lump rise in his throat, his chest tightening as the full force of his mistake hit him. He had sold his own flesh and blood for money, for a chance at redemption that would never come. "Please," he whispered, but he didn't even know what he was pleading for anymore. Forgiveness? A second chance? The return of something that was already lost, beyond repair? But his wife didn't look at him, and his daughter seemed to shrink further into her mother's embrace. The gap between them was widening, not just in distance, but in something much deeper. Something that couldn't be mended with apologies. The weight of their silence pressed down on him, suffocating him. The house felt smaller now, like a cage. There was no escape from the truth, not for any of them. "Mommy." His daughter's voice broke through the silence, soft but insistent. His wife didn't answer, her focus still entirely on the child, as if she were trying to shield her from the reality that had invaded their home. John took a deep breath, and for a moment he thought about leaving, turning away, walking out into the night, where he could disappear and escape from this hell he had created. But he knew he couldn't. He couldn't leave them. He had already taken so much from them, and now there was nothing left to do but face the consequences of his actions. His daughter looked at him one last time, her small eyes wide with confusion, but the trust that had once been there was gone, and in that single look he saw the final nail in the coffin of everything he had ever loved. His wife finally spoke, her voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. "You need to leave." The words hit him like a slap, and for the first time, he truly understood the weight of them. It wasn't just about the house or the space between them. It was about his place in their lives, his place in this family. There was no place for him anymore. Not in their world. Not in their future. The truth was, he had already left. And this time, there was no coming back. The door closed softly behind him, but the sound felt like a thunderclap in his ears. His body was numb as he stepped out onto the cold porch, the air sharp and biting. It felt like the world had been frozen in that one moment, when he had heard his wife's final words. Words that severed any connection to the life he had once known. "Leave." The word rang in his mind, over and over, a haunting refrain that refused to fade. He wasn't sure if he had heard it right, but he had. She had told him to leave, and he had. He had no place left there, no home, no family. He stood still, barely aware of the icy wind cutting through him, the chill that seemed to reach down into his very soul. His heart, once full of love and hope, now felt like an empty, hollow shell. He had destroyed everything. There were no tears left, no anger, just this overwhelming emptiness. The pain of his wife's betrayal was nothing compared to the loss of his daughter's trust. She hadn't even said goodbye. He glanced back at the house, but it felt like a distant memory now, an illusion of what was once whole, now shattered beyond recognition. The life he had lived was over, and there was no rebuilding it. No second chance. His footsteps were heavy, each one echoing in the quiet night, as if the world itself was silent in judgment of him. He had no destination in mind, no plans, no hope. Just a path ahead, dark and uncertain, and the constant ache in his chest, reminding him of what he had lost. He didn't know how long he walked. The streets were empty, the city cold and distant. It was late, and the world around him was asleep. But he wasn't, not anymore. He was awake to the full weight of his choices, and he couldn't escape them. At some point, he stopped. The quiet was unbearable, and he finally broke, not in a fit of anger or desperation, but in a slow, quiet collapse, his knees giving out beneath him, the weight of his guilt finally forcing him to the ground. He had sold his family for a chance at redemption, and now he was alone, more alone than he had ever been in his life. And as the night swallowed him whole, he realized there would be no forgiveness. Not for him. Not ever. The cold air wrapped around him like a shroud as he sat there, knees pulled to his chest, alone in the dark. The world seemed so far away now. He had walked away from everything, but in truth, there had been nowhere to go. The weight of the decision he had made hung over him like an anchor, dragging him deeper into the quiet abyss of regret. His mind replayed every moment, every word, every misstep that had led him here. The moment he had sealed their fate with that contract. The day he had sold his own daughter. The decisions made in desperation that had driven his wife away. And now, even his daughter, his sweet, innocent daughter, was lost to him forever. He had thought once that a way out existed, that there was a solution, some form of redemption. But now he understood. There was no escape from the consequences of his actions. No amount of apologies could erase the damage he had done. He raised his eyes to the sky, though it was too dark to see the stars. It was quiet, too quiet, and yet the silence was louder than any noise. His thoughts were fragmented, broken pieces of a life he had once known. He had destroyed it all, and now there was nothing left but the hollow echo of what could have been. Time seemed to slow, each passing second stretching out as if he were standing on the edge of something he couldn't name. There was no rush to leave, no desire to move forward, only the cold, heavy weight of his own despair. His body ached from exhaustion, from the toll of guilt, but his heart felt heavier. In the distance, he heard the faint sound of traffic, the hum of a world that kept moving even though his had come to a complete stop. He wasn't sure what time it was anymore. The world felt like it had frozen in place, just as he had. But then, something unexpected happened. A soft thought, barely a whisper, crossed his mind. Not a thought of hope, not a wish for redemption. Just the quiet, simple understanding that he had no choice but to keep going. Even if it was just to walk the empty road alone, he would move forward. Because there was no turning back. There was only the path ahead. With that realization, he stood up, his legs shaky but determined. The road was long, and his journey was far from over. But somehow in that moment, he understood that this was his punishment, his reckoning, and all he could do now was walk, because there was nothing else left.